A United States Army Signals colonel walked into a briefing room at Long Bin on a gray Tuesday morning in March of 1968, carrying a manila folder thick enough to anchor a jeep and prepared to deliver what he considered the most straightforward administrative correction of his entire Vietnam tour. Sitting across the table from him was a major from the 1st Australian Task Force Signal Staff, a lean, sun-darkened man who had spent the previous 18 months coordinating communications for the most effective small unit reconnaissance force in the entire country. The colonel opened his folder, spread a series of signals assessment documents across the table, and explained, in the tone of a man who expected no argument and had never received any, that Australian SAS communications protocols operating in Phuoc Thi Province were non-compliant with Military Assistance Command Vietnam standardization directives, that they represented a coordination liability for Allied operations, and that they were, in the colonel's specific words, a security risk to the broader theater network. He then slid a proposed remediation framework across the table. Australian SAS patrols would adopt American radio scheduling. They would observe American check-in intervals. They would use American cipher procedures and move toward alignment with the ANPRC-25 communication system that every other American and Allied unit in country was already using. The Australian major looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up at the colonel and said 9 words that would generate a paper chain reaching from Nui Dat to Canberra before the week was out. "With respect, Colonel, that will get our men killed." Wait, what? The Americans were running a communications empire across South Vietnam. They had deployed the most sophisticated military signals infrastructure ever assembled in wartime. They had 1st Signal Brigade troops stringing tropospheric scatterlinks from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ. They had secure voice equipment, they had relay aircraft, they had the full weight of American technical dominance behind every transmission. And an Australian major sitting in a plywood briefing room at Long Bin was telling a colonel that American communications doctrine was going to kill people? Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what that Australian major knew, what the signals colonel apparently did not fully appreciate, was that by 1968 the enemy in South Vietnam had been reading American radio traffic for years. Not occasionally, routinely, systematically, with dedicated teams, captured equipment, English-speaking intercept operators, and a tactical intelligence picture assembled almost entirely from listening to the frequencies the Americans had just proposed the Australian SAS start using. One declassified American assessment from that period, produced by the Army Security Agency and buried in signal security archives for decades, contained a finding that should have changed the way every commander in Vietnam thought about his radio. 11 words that amounted to a confession of institutional failure. Enemy exploitation of Allied radio communications continues to provide significant tactical advantage. You are about to discover why the tiniest detail in the Vietnam War, the difference between a radio transmission made and a radio transmission withheld, became a matter of life and death for 5-man Australian patrols operating deep inside enemy-controlled jungle. And by the end of this, you will understand why the Australian SAS communication system that one American colonel tried to dismantle as non-compliant was, in fact, the most battle-proven communications security doctrine in the entire theater. An approach forged in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo, refined through years of operating in environments where the enemy was always listening, and so comprehensively proven by 1968 that the Australians would rather generate a diplomatic incident than abandon it. Stay with me. The thing about radio communications in the Vietnam War that the American military establishment consistently failed to internalize, from the earliest Special Forces advisors in 1962 all the way through to the final withdrawals in 1972, was that the enemy was not passive. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong did not simply sit in their tunnels and wait to be found. They gathered intelligence. They intercepted transmissions. They built an entire shadow intelligence architecture around the extraordinary generosity with which American units broadcast their intentions, their positions, their schedules, and their vulnerabilities across the electromagnetic spectrum every single day. This was not a secret. It was known. It had been briefed, reported, assessed, and documented by American signals security personnel throughout the war, and it had been largely ignored by the commanders who mattered. The Army Security Agency, the organization responsible for both gathering signals intelligence against enemy forces and monitoring American communication security, had been present in Vietnam since 1961. By 1966, the year the first Australian task force established itself at Nui Dat in Phuoc Thai Province, the Army Security Agency was running what amounted to a parallel intelligence war alongside the main effort. Their analysts were intercepting North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong radio traffic, tracking unit movements, identifying command structures, and providing battlefield intelligence that saved lives. They were also, with increasing frequency and increasing frustration, documenting the catastrophic state of American radio security and presenting those findings to commanders who responded with something between polite indifference and active hostility. The scale of the problem was staggering. American units at every level were conducting what signals security personnel called communication violations, at rates that would have been considered unacceptable in any previous American war. Units were keeping the same radio frequencies for weeks at a time, making it trivially easy for enemy intercept teams to find and follow them. They were using the same call signs long past the point where rotation was required. They were speaking in plain language about sensitive operational details, using nicknames for commanders that the enemy had catalogued and identified. They were making predictable check-in transmissions at predictable times, providing enemy forces with a reliable schedule of when American units were active and where their radios were physically located. Major General Harry Kinnard, commanding the 1st Cavalry Division before deployment, had received a report documenting 11,000 communications violations during pre-deployment training. His response was to dismiss the concern entirely. If the enemy could hear American radio traffic and understand English well enough to use it, Kinnard argued, the Americans moved so fast the enemy could never exploit it in time. That assessment was wrong. It was wrong at the Ia Drang Valley in 1965, where North Vietnamese Army commanders had extremely detailed knowledge of American positions and intentions before the battle began. It was wrong at Dak To in 1967, where enemy forces were positioning themselves based on intercepted American radio traffic. It was catastrophically wrong when the Tet Offensive launched in January 1968, and the scale of enemy operational security in concealing the attack revealed that the North Vietnamese Army had become entirely comfortable planning around the intelligence they derived from monitoring American communications while simultaneously keeping their own preparations almost completely dark. The Australians knew all of this. They knew it not because they had access to better American intelligence assessments, though 547 Signal Troop at Nui Dat, the secret Australian Signals Intelligence Unit that most Americans in Vietnam did not even know existed, was certainly providing the Australian Task Force commander with a clear picture of what enemy communications interception looked like from the other side. They knew it because their entire military culture had been shaped by environments where radio silence was not a preference or a tactical nicety. It was a survival imperative. The Special Air Service Regiment that arrived in Vietnam in April 1966 was a direct institutional descendant of the British SAS, modified and hardened by a decade of operations in two of the most demanding jungle warfare environments in the world. Malaya during the emergency from 1948 to 1960 had taught the Australians what patient, intelligence-driven counterinsurgency looked like when it worked. Borneo, during the confrontation with Indonesia from 1963 to 1966, had reinforced every lesson Malaya had taught and added new ones, because the Indonesian Army's signals intelligence capability was considerably more sophisticated than the Malayan Communist parties had been. Australian SAS troopers operating along the Indonesian border in Borneo had conducted operations of extraordinary delicacy, inserting into denied areas, moving without any radio traffic whatsoever for days at a time, communicating in compressed Morse code bursts during specific transmission windows so brief that direction-finding equipment had no practical opportunity to locate them. They had used one-time letterpad codes that provided a layer of encryption so robust that even if a transmission was captured and recorded, it could not be broken without the corresponding pad. They had, through years of operational experience, developed a communications philosophy that treated the radio not as a lifeline, but as a precisely controlled tool with a threat profile that had to be managed as carefully as any other element of the patrol. The Australian SAS 1963 training records are instructive. When an exercise called Long Hop revealed communications weaknesses in the SAS company that year, the response was not to improve scheduling or increase transmission frequency. The signals officer, Lieutenant Darrell Slade, began training all radio operators in skywave high-frequency transmissions rather than the shorter-range ground wave and VHF transmissions that were easier to intercept and direction find. The training was extended to every rank in the unit. Additional training in Morse code and one-time letterpad codes followed. This was 1963. 3 years before Vietnam, the Australian SAS was already building the communications security doctrine that would, 5 years later, find itself on a collision course with an American signals colonel in a plywood briefing room at Long Bin. By the time Australian SAS squadrons began rotating through Phuoc Thi province in 1966, their communications protocols had evolved into something almost invisible by American standards. A 5-man reconnaissance patrol inserted by helicopter into enemy-controlled jungle would move immediately after insertion, putting distance between itself and the landing zone before the rotors had even faded from earshot. It would then observe radio silence. Not operational silence, the patrol was very much at work, moving, observing, recording, tracking, radio silence. The patrol would select a pre-designated transmission window, typically once every 24 hours, and would communicate in that window using the shortest possible transmission, a brief coded signal, sent in Morse, encrypted with the one-time pad, lasting seconds rather than minutes. Between those windows, nothing, no check-ins, no situation reports, no requests for guidance or coordination. If the patrol was compromised, if it made contact with enemy forces or believed it had been discovered, it could break silence, but even that transmission would be as short as survivably possible. Get the information out, get off the air, keep moving. The American military, particularly the Signal Corps officers responsible for theater-wide communications standardization, looked at this system and saw a problem. They saw it as a problem for several interconnected reasons, and it is important to understand those reasons, because they were not entirely without merit. The Americans were running an alliance operation involving hundreds of thousands of troops from multiple nations across an enormous and complex battle space. Communications interoperability was a genuine operational requirement. If an Australian SAS patrol made contact with a major enemy force and needed immediate American artillery support or American gunship coverage, there had to be a functional communications link. The American system for providing that support was built around specific radio nets, specific procedures, specific authentication protocols. Units that used different systems, different procedures, different protocols, created friction in the network at exactly the moment when friction was most dangerous. There was also an institutional dimension that went beyond pure operational logic. The American Signal Corps in Vietnam was not simply providing communication services. It was building an empire. By 1967, 1st Signal Brigade had grown into one of the largest signal organizations in American military history, with more than 23,000 personnel, providing everything from backpack tactical radios to the integrated wideband communication system that connected Vietnam to the continental United States. The brigade's mission was not just to connect American units. It was to connect all Allied units into a coherent theater communications architecture. Units that operated outside that architecture were, from the Signal Brigade's perspective, gaps in the network. Gaps in the network were vulnerabilities. The Australian SAS, operating on their own frequencies, using their own cipher systems, maintaining silences that the American network had no way to monitor or verify, were a gap. And the Signal Corps colonel, whose job was to close gaps, was going to close this one.
The confrontation at Long Bin in March 1968 did not materialize from nothing. It was the culmination of a friction that had been building since the Australians first established their signals architecture at Nui Dat in mid-1966. American liaison officers assigned to the Australian task force had noted, with increasing concern and in progressively more formal memoranda, that Australian SAS communications procedures did not conform to Military Assistance Command Vietnam standardization requirements.
The Australians, for their part, had been explaining patiently and then less patiently that their procedures were not administrative oversights. They were operational necessities. The explanations had not been satisfying to American signals personnel, who tended to hear our doctrine as different, as we haven't been brought up to standard yet. The idea that the Australian doctrine might be superior, that it might represent hard-won lessons American doctrine had not yet learned, was not a framework that translated easily into American military culture in 1968. What the Australian major knew, sitting across from the colonel in that briefing room, was something that can now be reconstructed in detail from declassified American, Australian, and National Security Agency records.
He knew that 547 Signal Troop at Nui Dat had been monitoring Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army radio traffic since June 1966, building up an extraordinarily detailed picture of how enemy forces gathered signals intelligence and used it operationally. He knew that the enemy had captured American PAR-C-25 radios in significant numbers by early 1968, that they had English-speaking intercept operators trained specifically to follow American radio nets, that they had direction-finding equipment capable of locating transmitters from significant distances.
He knew, because 547 Signal Troop had documented it, that the enemy treated American radio transmissions as one of their primary intelligence sources. A National Security Agency history of communication security in Vietnam, classified for decades after the war, would later confirm that enemy exploitation of Allied radio communications provided significant tactical advantage throughout the conflict, and that American forces' communication security practices were chronically, systematically deficient. The Australian major also knew something more immediate, more visceral, more directly relevant to the lives of the men in the field. He knew what happened to patrols that talked too much. Not in theory, in practice. The Australian SAS had operated alongside American long-range reconnaissance patrols during various operations. They had watched American Special Operations doctrine applied in the jungle, and they had drawn specific conclusions. American recon patrols maintained regular radio contact with their headquarters. Those contacts, however brief and professionally conducted, created an electromagnetic signature. The enemy had learned to read that signature. In multiple documented cases across Vietnam, enemy forces had used intercepted radio traffic to track and position against American recon elements. The American doctrine's response to this problem was to provide better fire support, better extraction capability, more robust emergency communications. The Australian doctrine's response was to not create the signature in the first place. The confrontation at Long Bin lasted several hours and produced no immediate resolution. The signals colonel presented his standardization framework. The Australian major rejected it, calmly but absolutely, on operational grounds. The colonel escalated.
He pointed out, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Authority to set communication standards for all Allied forces operating in the theater. The Australian major responded that communications within the Australian Task Force's tactical area of operations in Phuoc Thai Province were an Australian operational matter, that they would be coordinated with American systems to the degree necessary for fire support and extraction procedures, but that Australian SAS patrol communications protocols were not subject to American standardization directives.
The colonel asked who was going to tell him that. The Australian major said, with the particular quietness of a man who knows he has institutional backing and is not bluffed by rank, that if the colonel wished to pursue the matter formally, the appropriate channel was through Military Assistance Command Vietnam to Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon, and from there through the Australian chain of command to Canberra. He then pointed out that the last time an American command authority had tried to redirect Australian task force operations through channels, the conversation had ended up on the desk of the Chief of the Australian General Staff and had taken 6 weeks to resolve. He was, of course, referring obliquely to the series of disagreements over operational control that had accompanied the establishment of the Australian Independent Area of Operations in Phuoc Thai from the beginning. The signals colonel took the position paper back to his headquarters. The Australian major returned to Nui Dat. The matter moved into the quiet machinery of inter-allied bureaucracy, which meant it moved slowly, and in the meantime Australian SAS patrols continued to operate exactly as they had been operating since 1966. Scheduled burst transmissions in one-time pad-encrypted Morse. Radio silence between windows. Insertion and extraction procedures that minimize the helicopter signature. Communication philosophy built on the foundational principle that the radio, used incorrectly, was not a tool that connected you to support. It was a beacon that connected the enemy to you. The technical specifics of what the Australians were protecting deserve attention because they illuminate the gap between Australian and American communications doctrine far more clearly than any bureaucratic argument could. The AN/PRC-25, the radio the signals colonel wanted Australian SAS patrols to standardize on, was an American FM manpack radio that had been introduced in 1964 and by 1967 was essentially ubiquitous among American ground forces. It was a genuinely excellent radio for its intended purpose. It was reliable, reasonably robust, and provided good voice communications quality in the frequency ranges it used. It was also, from an Australian SAS perspective, a communications security problem wrapped in green plastic. It operated on frequencies the enemy had learned to monitor. It was designed for voice communications, which meant every transmission carried not just information content, but a voice signature, and potentially operational language that trained intercept operators could exploit. Its FM transmission characteristics made direction finding relatively straightforward compared to the high-frequency Morse transmissions the Australians preferred. And the American protocols associated with it, regular check-ins, voice acknowledgments, the continuous back-and-forth traffic of a military radio net, created exactly the kind of sustained electromagnetic presence that Australian SAS doctrine had been specifically designed to avoid. The Australian system was built around the AN/GRC-109, a high-frequency radio that had been the standard of American Special Forces teams since the 1950s and was known to its users as the Angry Nine. It was hand-cranked for power and sent Morse code rather than voice. Those characteristics, which made it more demanding to operate than the PAR C-25, were also what made it safer. High-frequency skywave transmissions were harder to direction find accurately than FM voice. Morse transmissions were shorter than voice, reducing exposure time. One time, pad encryption made the content of any intercepted transmission essentially unreadable without the corresponding pad. And the Australian practice of brief, scheduled transmission windows meant the total electromagnetic exposure of any given patrol, measured in transmission time, was a fraction of what American recon procedures required. The Tet Offensive of January and February 1968, which had already happened by the time the Long Bin confrontation occurred, had provided the most dramatic possible demonstration of the consequence of communication security failures on the American side and communication security successes on the enemy side. North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces had coordinated the most complex nationwide offensive of the entire war with such effective communications discipline that American signals intelligence, despite having thousands of intercept operators and an enormous collection apparatus, had failed to provide adequate warning. The enemy had learned radio discipline. They had learned to move in silence, to communicate in short bursts, to use couriers rather than radios for the most sensitive coordination, to deny American signals intelligence the kind of sustained traffic that could be tracked and analyzed. They had, in other words, adopted the philosophy that the Australian SAS had been operating on for years. And then, at Tet, they had used that philosophy to achieve strategic surprise against an adversary who had more signals intelligence capability than anyone in history. The irony, visible only in retrospect, was rich. The American military was trying to impose its communications doctrine on the Australians at the same moment that the North Vietnamese Army was demonstrating, in the most costly possible way, why that doctrine was dangerously flawed. The enemy had beaten the American signals intelligence network by doing what the Australian SAS had always done. Stay off the air. Transmit briefly. Encrypt everything. Trust your operators to work independently between communication windows rather than requiring constant contact. The formal response to the signals kernel's standardization push came approximately 3 weeks after the Long Bin meeting, in the form of a message from Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon to the relevant American command authority. The message was not long. It was not heated. It was written in the controlled, precise language of Commonwealth military correspondence, which is to say it was perfectly polite and absolutely immovable. It acknowledged the importance of communications interoperability for fire support and extraction coordination, and committed Australian forces to maintaining compatible procedures for those specific functions. It stated that Australian SAS patrol communication security protocols were determined by Australian operational doctrine based on Australian operational experience, were not subject to Military Assistance Command Vietnam standardization requirements, and would not be altered. It then, in a paragraph that must have been satisfying to write, provided a brief factual summary of what the Australian SAS communication system was designed to prevent: systematic exploitation of patrol communications by enemy intercept teams, which the message noted was a documented feature of enemy intelligence operations throughout the theater. The response produced no further formal challenge from the American side. The signals colonel, to his professional credit, appears to have recognized that the argument was not winnable through channels. The Australian operational record was available to anyone who looked at it, and anyone who looked at it was going to struggle to frame Australian SAS communications procedures as a problem requiring correction. By March 1968, the Australian SAS had completed hundreds of combat patrols in Phuoc Thi province. They had lost 1 man killed in action, 1 dead of wounds, 3 in accidents, a kill ratio that exceeded any comparable special operations force in the theater. Patrols that routinely operated for 2 and 3 weeks in enemy controlled territory without support and without contact. An intelligence picture of Phuoc Thi province so detailed and so current that Australian task force commanders could make operational decisions that regularly anticipated enemy movements rather than reacting to them. None of that had been achieved by maintaining regular radio contact with headquarters. All of it had been achieved by staying quiet. The deeper technical argument, the one that the Long Bin confrontation had exposed but not fully explored, was about the relationship between communications doctrine and operational philosophy. American military communications in Vietnam were designed to support a specific way of fighting. Continuous contact enabled continuous coordination. Continuous coordination enabled the rapid application of massed firepower. The American answer to almost any tactical problem in Vietnam was fire support, and fire support required communication, and communication required radio. The logic was internally consistent. It was also in jungle warfare against an enemy that had learned to exploit that logic, a vulnerability built into the architecture of American operations. Australian SAS operations were designed around a different principle. The patrol was the intelligence. 5 men, operating in silence, gathering information over days and weeks, were more valuable than 100 men conducting a noisy sweep that announced itself to every enemy observation post in the province. The radio was a support tool for that intelligence function, not a command and control lifeline. When a patrol needed fire support or extraction, it would communicate.
When it did not need those things, it would not communicate. The silence was not a failure of connectivity. It was the method. This was the point that the signals colonel had missed. He had looked at Australian SAS communications protocols and seen a network gap. What was actually in front of him was a complete, coherent, operationally validated doctrine, built on the hard-won understanding that in the specific environment of Vietnam, the most dangerous transmission a 5-man reconnaissance patrol could make was the one that told the enemy it was there.
The AN/PRC-25 versus the one-time Pad Morse system was not really an argument about radios. It was an argument about what radio was for. Americans believed radio was for connecting units to the command structure that would support them. Australians believed radio was a weapon that cut both ways, and that its use required as much tactical judgment as any other weapon in the patrol's inventory. The consequences of the American approach were documented, painfully and repeatedly, in the war's casualty rolls. Long-range reconnaissance patrol teams that made contact and were subsequently tracked through their own radio traffic, units that transmitted their positions during planning phases and found the enemy waiting in prepared ambush positions when they arrived. The 1965 Ia Drang battle, where North Vietnamese Army commanders had a detailed understanding of 1st Cavalry positioning, derived in significant part from radio intercept. Dak To in 1967, where intercept teams had been following American radio traffic in the weeks before the battle. The pattern was consistent, the documentation extensive, and the institutional response, for the most part, inadequate. What changed eventually, slowly, and in direct response to accumulated casualties, was that American communication security began to improve. The KY-38 secure voice device, paired with the PRC-77 radio, began reaching infantry battalions in September 1968, providing encrypted voice communications at the tactical level for the first time. The Army Security Agency's Communications Security Monitoring Program became more aggressive in reporting violations and working with commanders to address them. Radio procedures tightened. Some units began adopting shorter transmission windows, more frequent call sign changes, better encryption discipline. But these improvements came years into the war and fell well short of what the Australian SAS had been doing from the beginning. The Australian major who had sat across from the signals colonel in March 1968 retired from the Australian Army in the early 1970s with a service medal earned in Vietnam among his decorations. His name does not appear in any of the publicly available records from the Long Bin confrontation, because the confrontation itself generated mostly internal correspondence that has been partly declassified on the Australian side and largely remains inaccessible on the American side. But the operational record he was defending is entirely visible. 1,200 combat patrols by the end of the Australian commitment. 1 killed in action, an extraordinary figure for the quantity and intensity of the operations conducted. A communication system so effective at denying the enemy information about patrol locations that the Viet Cong intelligence documents from Phuoc Thi province repeatedly noted the inability to locate or predict Australian SAS movements, using the term Marung jungle ghosts for men who appeared and disappeared without the radio signature that would have allowed enemy forces to track them. The broader story of the Long Bin communications confrontation was, in one sense, a story about institutional knowledge and the speed at which it travels, or fails to travel, across organizational boundaries. The Australian SAS had knowledge, earned through 15 years of jungle operations in Malaya and Borneo, that American signals doctrine had not yet arrived at. That knowledge was not theoretical. It was encoded in specific procedures, specific equipment choices, specific training requirements that could have been shared, studied, adopted. Instead, the dominant institutional reflex on the American side was standardization. Make the Allied unit conform to the American system. Because the American system was large, it was resourced, it was documented, and deviation from it created complexity. The possibility that the smaller Allied unit might be operating from a more sophisticated base of operational experience was not the default assumption. This was a specific instance of a general pattern that characterized the Australian-American alliance in Vietnam throughout the conflict. The Australians came to the war with hard-won expertise in precisely the kind of unconventional, patient, intelligence-driven warfare that Vietnam demanded. They applied that expertise in Phuoc Thi province and achieved results that outperformed any comparable American effort on almost every metric that mattered. And they spent 5 years defending their methods against American pressure to conform to an approach they knew, from experience rather than theory, was less effective. The communications confrontation of March 1968 was a concentrated version of every other argument the Australians had fought since Brigadier Jackson walked out of a Long Bin briefing in 1966. The methods are different. The difference is not a deficiency. The difference is the point. 547 Signal Troop, the secret Australian Signals Intelligence Unit at Nui Dat, represents perhaps the most instructive coda to the entire episode. This was the unit that most Americans in Vietnam did not know existed. Its presence was so carefully protected that it did not appear on most maps of Australian task force positions. It operated under the operational control of the American Army Security Agency's 509th Radio Research Group, which meant it was part of the very signals intelligence architecture the Americans were trying to extend to Allied forces. And it was extraordinarily effective. Its 15 experienced operators tracked enemy radio transmitters to within 400 meters of their actual positions. Before the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, 547 Signal Troop had tracked the 275 Viet Cong Regiment's radio transmitter as it moved toward Nui Dat for 16 days. The intelligence it provided was so sensitive that only the task force commander, his operations officer, and 2 intelligence officers knew its source. Battalion commanders received the intelligence but were not told where it came from, to prevent the enemy from deducing that their traffic was being monitored. The Australians were, in other words, doing to the enemy precisely what the enemy was trying to do to the Americans. They were listening. They were tracking. They were building an intelligence picture from the electromagnetic signatures of enemy communications. And they were protecting their own communications with exactly the discipline required to deny the enemy the same opportunity. When the American signals colonel proposed bringing Australian SAS communications into the American network, he was proposing, whether he understood this or not, to reduce the Australian SAS to the same signal security standard that 547 Signal Troop was systematically exploiting against enemy forces every day. The Australian major's 9 words with respect, Colonel, that we'll get our men killed, were not an overstatement. They were a precise technical assessment delivered in the compressed language of a professional soldier who did not have time to explain 20 years of signal security doctrine in a single briefing room meeting. They were the distillation of Malaya and Borneo and hundreds of patrols in Phuoc Thai province and 15 operators in a sandbagged set room at Nui Dat, listening to the enemy reveal itself through its own transmissions. They were the Australian Army saying, as it had said to every command authority that had tried to redirect Australian professional judgment since Singapore in 1942, that the method had been tested, the method had been proven, and the method was not negotiable. The radio stayed quiet. The patrols stayed invisible. The jungle ghosts of Phuoc Thai province continued to appear out of the green silence and disappear back into it, never where the enemy expected them, because the enemy had no radio traffic to follow. The standardization directive was filed and forgotten, and somewhere in the set room at Nui Dat, the operators of 547 Signal Troop sat at their receivers with headsets on and notebooks ready, listening to the enemy talk, while across the province 5 men at a time moved through the jungle without saying a word. That asymmetry, one side talking and the other side listening, defined the intelligence war inside the broader tactical war that Vietnam actually was. The side that stayed quiet knew where the other side was. The side that talked gave the other side what it needed to know where they were. The Australian SAS communication system was not a protocol deviation or an interoperability problem or a gap in the Allied network. It was the correct answer to the correct question. The question was not how do we stay connected to our headquarters. The question was how do we deny the enemy the intelligence that will get us killed. And the answer, forged in the wet heat of Malayan jungle in the 1950s, refined in the shadow war border operations of Borneo in the 1960s, and proved beyond any reasonable dispute in the rubber plantations and river valleys of Phuoc Thai province, was the same answer it had always been. Stay off the air. Trust the patrol. Let the silence do its work. Your communications protocol is a security risk. 9 words, delivered in a plywood room at Long Bin, aimed at the communications doctrine of the most effective special operations force in the Vietnam theater. 9 words that revealed not a flaw in Australian procedure, but a flaw in American understanding. The protocol was not the risk. The protocol was the reason the jungle ghosts stayed ghosts, and the man who tried to change it, whatever his intentions and however sound his administrative reasoning, was asking the Australians to surrender the one operational advantage that no amount of American firepower, no number of PRC-25 radios, and no thickness of standardization directive could have replaced. The advantage of silence. The Australians kept it. The war, for those 5-man patrols in the green dark of Fuoktai province, went on.